So thank you all for joining us. My name is Rabbi Kohl. I'm one of the rabbis here at that Tzedek congregation, and I'm very pleased on behalf of UJA Federation of Greater Toronto and the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs to welcome you here this evening to Beth Tzedek. On behalf of David Kushitsky, who is the chair of Souza and who's here tonight, again, I want to extend a welcome. Approximately 20 years ago, I was studying at the Episcopal Divinity School at Harvard, and in a seminar, one of the Protestant ministers who was present said to me, "Why are Jews so sensitive to the criticism of Israel? Why does everything suddenly become an issue of anti-Semitism?" That was really the first time, and it was about 20 years ago, that I began to realize how differently Jews and others read comments about Israel and about anti-Jewish attitudes. A few years ago, I was meeting with the leadership of the United Church of Canada, and we were discussing the position of the church in relationship to Israel. We talked about how there had been demonstrations outside of the Israeli consulate on Bloor Street that had shifted. People had begun speaking about their opposition to certain Israeli policies, but then began talking about the Jews. And what I said to the moderator of the church at the time is that there's a slippery slope that begins in rhetoric and in action that moves people, some people, from what appears to be a criticism of an Israeli policy to a criticism of Zionism, to a criticism of Jews. Over the years, there's been a lot of discussion and debate about this. And tonight, we're going to have what I hope will be an illuminating discussion about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the blurry red line. I'm going to welcome Father Raymond J. Souza, who is the moderator of the panel tonight. And Father Souza will introduce the subject as well as the panelists. Be ready for some very challenging ideas and some very nuanced ideas. And be ready as well with your own questions after. Thank you.
Good evening all, and thank you to congregation for gathering here. I Burke for his warm words of welcome. I've actually been here at Tzedek before, a few years ago. It's good to be back. And tonight I'm going to speak very briefly, just to introduce the evening and the speakers, because my job is simply to moderate the debate, or the exchange, really not debate. I've been asked to remind you to take your cell phones and dispose of them. No, just turn them off. I'm actually going to turn mine on because I have some notes on it, but I'll keep them in such a way that will not disturb others. Our program is that we have two professors who will speak to us today, Professor Catherine Chatterley and Professor David Hirsch. They'll speak for about 25 minutes each, and then we'll have time for questions. I think I'll be leading off the question period, and we aim to finish at about 9:30. So that's our program with logistics. Our topic is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the blurry red line. That is to say, what is the distinction between the two? I'm not really going to lay out those questions except to say that there are things that are clearly legitimate in a sense, to disagree with a particular policy of the Israeli government, which many Israelis themselves do, of course. On one hand, is very benign, and then you move along the spectrum, and our professors are going to identify the points at which something that might become anti-Zionist, and then perhaps even anti-Semitic. We have two distinguished and accomplished speakers this evening. I'm just going to begin with a short observation. I just got back actually from Israel yesterday. I'm on the board of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and I was there accompanying some Canadians who were visiting Israel for the first time. And over the course of the weekend, I had my time with them, and then I had some time on my own. And in the space of 24 hours, on Saturday afternoon, I went to Nablus, which is, as you know, in the center, the heart of the West Bank. And then on Sunday morning, very early, we went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to say Mass there with our Canadian visitors. And then we went, all of us together, accompanied by Canadian Embassy officials, to the Temple Mount and went into the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It was the first time I'd done that, actually. And then later in the day, separately on my own, I went to Hebron, and I spent the day with the settlers there at the Tel Hebron on the top, where the sort of archaeological things are, and the Machpelah, the shrine of the patriarchs. I don't think there's anybody else on the planet who did those things in 24 hours. It's quite a range. And in fact, it would be very difficult for a Jew or a Muslim to do that, actually. Almost impossible, unless you were being rather clandestine about what you were doing. Part of the reason for that is training as a journalist, but also as a priest, is to try and listen, and to try and understand from the people who are there what it is or how it is that they think. One of my most recent projects, if I might do a little self-promotion, I suppose, is a magazine called Convivium, which just started, about faith in our common life. I hope it's of interest to some of you. Our premier issue in March actually had a lovely essay by Hugh Siegel about the Queen's Diamond Jubilee and what it meant as a little boy growing up in Montreal when his rabbi got to meet the Queen. Communities talking across each other, communities talking within each other. It's a very important thing that we often neglect, and especially when it comes to questions like anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, state of Israel, the whole situation in the Middle East. There is a lack of informed conversation. There's no lack of talk, and no lack of sometimes acrimonious exchange. But tonight we're going to have, within a certain community, we're going to have an informed conversation. So I'm honored that I was asked on behalf of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, of which I'm on the board, to moderate this debate. Let me close just with one anecdote before I introduce our first speaker. This is the Jerusalem Post magazine from last Friday. It actually has a thing on Nakba Day, which is today, by the way, on the front, but it has, I was pleased to see, a feature on Canadian journalists. It's called Young Canadian Jews Speak Out For and Against Israel. Now, the three that they chose to highlight, Ezra Levant, Marnie Sukroff, and Jonathan Kay, are all kind of on the for side, but nonetheless. It's an interesting comment about precisely what we're going to get to tonight. What's permissible to say, what's permissible not to say. This is what Jonathan Kay, who's actually my supervisor, my editor at the Post. I'm not sure if John is here tonight. If he is, I should mind my words. He always minds my words, actually. It's his job. But Jonathan says at the end of this article here about what's distinctive about he and his fellow Jews who are prominent players in Canadian journalism. He says, this is Jonathan, I think the only special contribution we Jewish journalists can make is that we can speak more truthfully about the situation in Israel because we are Jews. Similarly, I can speak about anti-Semitism not really being a problem anymore in Canada. If my name was Muhammad or Winston Hawthorpe, I couldn't do that. It's an interesting point that John makes about who can say what. And when it comes to questions like anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, both Jewish and non-Jewish voices have a contribution to make. We have one of each tonight, and I think you're in for a very illuminating debate. Exchange, I said debate 3 times now, I meant exchange. But if our